All right, good job, Johnny. We've been telling you to yell at me. Good job. All right. So as we're this year, the last week of the month, we're looking at wisdom. We're talking about the way of wisdom from Proverbs. And what we're looking at today is the difference between the wise and the foolish when it comes to possessions, when it comes to stuff. What is the difference between a man who is wise when it comes to stuff and the difference between a man who is foolish? And one of the things you want to really note in the Proverbs is this. Proverbs is filled with verses with compare and contrast. This is what it means to be wise and love God, and this is what it means to be a moron and hate God. Like that's pretty much the tension that is throughout the Proverbs, okay? And so we're going to look at today this tension between people who manage their stuff well and those who don't, and what that has to do with following God. Now, what we want to look at today then is I want to look at kind of these three things. First, we're going to look at the differences that we see in Proverbs 21:20. The second thing that we're going to look at is an example of a miser or the fool. Okay, and that is from Christ. And then also another example from one of Christ's parables is the example of what a wise man looks like. Okay, and we're going to go and see what Jesus has to say, because another important scripture connection between the Proverbs and the Gospels is that the Gospels are trying to, one of the things out of many of the points they make about Christ is that Christ is the embodiment of wisdom. In other words, if you want to know what somebody who takes Proverbs and literally lives them out perfectly, what would that person look like? Ta-da, here's Jesus. Jesus is living all those Proverbs out perfectly, okay? And so we want to go wisdom, right? The wisest man who had ever lived until Christ, right? We take his wisdom and then we see it used in real life when we look at the person of Christ. And so I think all the more reason to go to Christ to flesh these things out and see what he has to say even more so. So, our first one, the differences that we see here in Proverbs between the wise and the foolish. So, we see here, verse 20, precious treasure and oil are in the wise man's dwelling. So, what does the wise man have? He has treasure and oil, or in other words, wealth. To put it in modern terms, right, he has a decent 401k, right? He has his house is paid for, okay? He has you over to dinner, and he has, apple cider in his stores, right? Like, if you haven't ordered it right, he has different things, right, stored up to put on his table of food, of good quality, okay? Because, so he has treasure, he has a good savings account, okay? He is in a place of financial stability. And I think one way to look at it too, we're not just talking fantastically wealthy here, all right? We're just talking about somebody who has stuff put away. Okay, and then on the other hand, we have the foolish man. All right, and he has nothing. Now, why does he have nothing? Why do we say he has nothing? Because the text doesn't actually say he has nothing. The text says, but the foolish man does something. It says he devours all that he has. Which means that the difference between the wise man and the foolish man is that the wise man saves. And the foolish man, as soon as he gets his hands on it, it's gone. Okay, now, before we continue, we all, hopefully we all understand that things can happen in life, right? Like Job, right? Job is poor and destitute, not because he did anything wrong. He didn't go from being rich to poor because he made a mistake, but it was an act of God, right? God makes the poor, God makes the rich, he makes them alike, right? And so we want to be careful that we don't just judge everybody who doesn't have things and just assume it's because they made bad decisions. But on the other hand, particularly in the United States, right, where we are the richest country, probably not only in the world currently, but the one the world has ever seen, we want to be careful and say, well, it's because these bad things have happened to me, when maybe the issue actually has to be, I was not putting things aside, so I wasn't unable to weather the bad things that happened to me. Right? We like, as I said, we also know bad, like if you lived in Ukraine, you might save, your house might have been good, you did all things right, and then a bomb comes and blows it to smithereens, right? And when you have a war like that, there's no insurance that's going to cover you, right? Like that's just, like sometimes those things happen. Okay, but we're not talking about that here, right? We're talking, generally speaking, there's a difference between the wise man's dwelling and the foolish man's dwelling, and here's the difference. All right, one has treasure, one has nothing, because one consumes everything. And one of the things I want each of you to do as we work through this is I want you to ask yourself, am I foolish or am I wise with my possessions? Which one is me? Do I consume everything my hand touches or not? And you have to do this yourself. Get your paper out, get your pen out, and just list things about yourself. To be honest about yourself. Because true change and success never comes unless we're what? Honest with where we're really at. Right? In the United States, abortion will not end. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it will not end till the people of the Commonwealth, the people, not the politicians, because they're never honest about anything, till the people are honest with themselves about what abortion really is. And I would say in the women who have had abortions, true healing can't even come to them until they're honest about what they did. And when they're honest about what they did, then true healing comes. The scripture tells us, right? He who covers his sins will not prosper. Okay? And so, we want to be honest with ourselves today. In one way, like the stimulus checks that we all got. And most assuredly, we'll all get again, probably not this year, but next year, somewhere between July and August and September, right? Because it's getting close to election year, right? So that's how that works. Just so you know, right? You don't expect to be the last one you get. What did you do with that money? Now, certainly there was COVID and different things. So for some people, it was like, I didn't, maybe they didn't plan on all those things happen, so they weren't prepared, so it went to paying bills. Maybe some people were prepared, but like we said, they were one of the particular businesses that just got wiped out, right? So again, it had to go to pay bills. Or perhaps you were someone who's like, hey, I prepared for this, I'm in good financial shape, but I'm going to save it because who knows what's going to happen at the end of this, like crazy inflation, right? Or you thought, I'm going to invest it. I'm going to use it, and I'm going to use it for a house payment, or I'm going to put it in I have a little extra money, I can put it, the stock market's down now, I can invest in my 401k, whatever those things were. Or you said, awesome, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to order out, I'm going to subscribe to every streaming channel there is, right? But yet, right, and then the money's gone, isn't it? It's gone, right? Because I spent it on things, it's not just that I have money and I spend it, but it's what I spend it on. Did I invest it in something that is useful, okay? Or did I use it on something that no longer has value? Okay, now obviously we all have to eat, right? But there is a difference between going, say, to Aldi's and buying food for a couple of weeks and spending that same amount of food on Texas Roadhouse. Now, there is nothing wrong or evil about going out to eat or going to Texas Roadhouse. I want to be clear about that. But the question is, are we being good stewards with what we got? Okay? And do we have the money for those things? So those are some things, so you can ask yourself, if you can remember, what did I do with that stimulus check and why? What did I do with it and why? I think another important thing to point out too is the wise man doesn't get his treasure overnight. Okay, if we go back in chapter 21 to verse 5, it says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty, right? We had our little puppet sketch of the guy that played the lottery, right? Got rich quick and then it's all gone. Right? The plans of the diligent. So he doesn't get this treasure in the store overnight. It comes from over time, making wise decisions, saving money, investing it wisely, and letting it build up over time. And for some people, it doesn't take them very long to achieve it by following those simple principles. And other people, it takes longer. For multiple reasons. One is some of us just make more at what we do. Some people have the gift of God. Like God has reached out and touched them, and literally everything they touch is amazingly successful. But even if you're not particularly talented, if you follow these principles, you will get there. And the principle that's really put forward is this: consume less than you produce. That's the principle. As long as you continually consume less than you produce, you will have excess. Okay? And that way, when the storm comes, or as Ramsey's group like to say, when the rainy day comes, right, and you may call me pessimist or whatever, but I am 100% confident of one thing that will happen: it will rain. You need to be ready for it. All right? So, that's some of the things we see. He doesn't get it overnight. And in order to do that, then, the wise man has to learn to be content. And this is something very strange. Right now, certainly, I'm not suggesting here that all rich people are content. I'm not suggesting that. But we very often don't think of rich people being content, right? We think of poor people are the ones who are content, and rich people are the ones who are uncontent, right? That's how our mind thinks. And certainly we see very often there are very many rich people who are very uncontent and very miserable. Okay, it's a heart condition. We'll talk to that a little bit later. But what he's saying here is actually, because in order to build wealth over time, what do you have to do? You have to say no. You have to be content with the things that you already have, don't you? Because the foolish man, as soon as he says, I want that, boom, he buys it. I want that, boom, he buys it. I want that car, I don't care what the payments are on it, boom, I got it. It's the person who's content and says no later, or no, I don't need that. In fact, I believe Dave Ramsey's daughter, Rachel, she works with him. Every year she does this thing where she says, she picks out 5 different things and 5 different ways she's going to save money, right? Little normal everyday things. And like she said, she's like, if you decide that you don't do what I choose to do to save money, you're not bad, right? Like it's like, these are just things that I'm letting you know that me and my family decide we're not going to do. And she was talking about one of the things they chose to do was she wasn't going to take the kids out for ice cream. And she said she could not believe the comment she got about that. And she's like, you know what? I don't think I'm a horrible mom. My kids will be okay if they don't go out for ice cream for a year. Like, they will survive. They get plenty of things at home. They'll be okay. And her point wasn't that, just because you take your kids out for ice cream, somehow you're wasting money. But she said for her and her family at that time, that was a way in which they could save some money. And so they chose to do that. They chose to be content for not going out for ice cream. And, she didn't say anything in there that they weren't going to have any ice cream ever. I mean, it is cheaper to go and buy the gallon than, there's things you can do. And I think it's important to understand that God has given us stuff and we can be stewards with it differently, and it's okay. Right? Now, notice here something, though. God says you are a fool if you consume all you make. This is what God says. Well, what is a fool? Well, let's go to Psalms 14:1. See, a fool, scripturally speaking, isn't just, I'm out hunting with Luke, and Luke slips on a rock and falls down, and I say, ha ha, you moron, you slipped on a rock and fell. That's not the biblical definition of a fool, okay? A bunch of guys just goofing off in the middle of the woods, all right? That's not, or anywhere else for that matter. That's not what God says. So here's what God says in Psalms 14. He says, the fool says in his heart. Now notice, it doesn't say that he says this out loud. Think about that. It doesn't say that he says this out loud. It just says he says it in his heart, in his thoughts. In his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. So a fool is somebody who says there's no God. A fool, then, everything he does is corrupt and abominable in God's eyes, and he never does anything good. Wow. And so this is what God says. If you consume everything you touch, you are in effect an atheist. At very least, you're a functioning anything but a Christian. This is what God says. This is not what Pastor Ben says. This isn't Pastor Ben's opinion of the text. It literally says, but the foolish man devours it. Okay? So just stop and think about that for a minute. Understand, that's a big deal to call somebody a fool. Right? Because Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, I mean, this is, for God to say that, in Matthew 5, I mean, Jesus warns against us calling others who claim to be believers fools. Matthew 5:21, you have heard that it was said, those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to the judgment. So Jesus takes it another step. Like, not only if you murder, you're going to be in trouble. If you're angry with your brother, you're in trouble. But then he goes even further. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to hellfire. Whoever says to his brother, who's truly a believer, you are not a believer. I mean, going around and telling people that they're not really following Jesus, you kind of want to be pretty sure about that, particularly if they're following God. Right? So God, it's a big deal then if God thinks it's that serious for God then to say, if you consume everything that comes into your hands, you are godless. I mean, that is a big deal. Okay? That is heavy stuff. And so what does that say for you? What does that say for the church and the United States as a whole? Did you know, I think this is 22 stats. As of November, 63% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck, according to a monthly Leading Club report, up from 60% the previous month, and near the 64 historic high hit in March. Now, obviously, they're making a big deal about the economy going bad and inflation. But you realize it was only up 63%. They're already at 60%. You can't just blame everybody living paycheck to paycheck on the fact that we're going through an economic hard time when, 60% before we're already there. But see, and it's not just the average American, even high-income earners are under pressure. Leading Club found of those earning more than 6 figures, 47% reported living paycheck to paycheck, a jump from the previous month's 43%. You're like, oh, 47, wow, must be the economy. Well, before the economy, it was only 43%. It has to do with lifestyle. It has to do that we've forgotten that godliness with contentment is great gain. And it's not about how much you make. Yes, somebody who doesn't make hardly anything, even if they do all these things right, even if they truly do consume less than they bring in, is not going to be wealthy, are they? But they are going to have more, aren't they? They are going to be in a better position than what they would be. Okay? Because there's lots of people who make lots and lots of money. And yet they still have nothing because they consume everything their hands touches. The United States, we're at 31 trillion in debt now. I mean, that's insane. And so just to help you wrap your head around it, that's $94,266 per person, not per household, not per worker, per person. So look around here. We have some young people here today, like under the age of 10. They are already over $94,000 in debt. A baby that is born today is already $94,000 of debt because of decisions we have made collectively as a nation. I see college-age kids here today. Bad enough trying to go to college or start a business or get ahead in life when you're already $94,000 behind the 8 ball. And don't give me that, oh, well, we had to pay for their education. Oh, what about infrastructure? Please. You could easily pay for all those things and not be $31 trillion in debt. It has to do with shooting little puppies up with cocaine because we want to see if it has a negative effect. Yeah, literally our government spends money on those kinds of things. Not to mention the great school system that in certain places of our country, not everywhere, but certain places of the country, they're failing in every test. Where did all the money go? How about tell the people of Ohio how great the infrastructure project worked out for them? Like, we just waste money foolishly. And, you know, we can blame politicians, but when 60-some% of the American public lives that way, our politicians are really what? An extension of who we are as a people and who we are as a church. I mean, 81% of people in the United States say they believe in God. I'm not saying 81% are saved. I'm just saying, you know, there's a huge disconnect, even within the church, for what we say we believe and how we actually live our lives. Now, what I want us to do now is look at our two examples. So the first one is an example of a miser who is actually still a fool. Because this person would actually fit, you would think, Proverbs 21:20. And it's important we look at this. So Luke 12:13. Someone in the crowd said to him, that is Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." All right, so the guy's dad died. Generally, in biblical times, the eldest son would get a double portion. Now, we don't know if he was taking more than he should have, or if the younger brother felt, hey, that's not fair that he gets double, he should share with me. All right, we don't really know the situation, but he's saying, hey, I want some more stuff. This is Jesus' response. But he said to him, "Man, who made me judge or arbiter over you?" I mean, this is Jesus, like literally the judge of the world, saying, look, this isn't my business. All right, but he goes on, and he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And this is important, because we want to be careful when you take a verse out of context. Here's one of the mistakes you can make. If you were to take Proverbs 21:20 out of context, if you took that out of context, you'd say, hey, if somebody has a great 401k, he has a great house, he has lots of money saved up, he must be godly and wise. Wrong. Because life does not exist in one's possessions, okay? You can't just make that judgment. All right. And he said to them, so go on. And he told them, and the other thing here is about covetousness, because the example we're going to get, he says, be aware of, right? We always think of covetousness as this. Hey, that dude has a nice car. I don't want to go out and work hard, I just want to steal his car. Or I want his car, I'd rather he wouldn't even have his car because I want it. That's covetousness, where if I see, hey, that dude has a cool car, I'm going to go work hard so I can have a car. We say, well, that's not, I think you got to be careful with that. Because in here, there's no indication that this guy who gets all this stuff did anything wrong to get it. Okay? There's no indication here that he does anything wrong to get any of the things he has. And he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now it's interesting, the land produced. Who gives the increase? God does, doesn't he? He enables the land to produce. And he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, and drink, and be merry. Retirement at 30, baby. Right? I get to spend the rest of my life in my beach house in Malibu. Right? I did it. 20, but God said to him, fool. Remember what does fool mean? Godless. This night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. See, the problem with this rich fool is not so much that he's rich, not that he has these things, but he doesn't care about who God is. He doesn't care about God. He doesn't view his stuff as God's. He views it as his to spend on who? Him. That's how he views his stuff. And that's the problem. In fact, for all we know, being in ancient Israel, he probably tithed his 10% because that was the law. So, we need to understand life, and this is what Jesus said, life is not about getting stuff. So the wise man who has treasure in his house, he doesn't have treasure because that's his goal in life. So life's not about getting stuff. The rich man pleased himself with God's gifts, as we talked about, who gives the increase. Now, how could he have used his wealth differently? If he used to be rich towards God, what would that look at? Well, there's all kinds of things. He could have gave to the poor, right? He could have gave to missions work. He could have gave to the work of the church. He could have given beyond his tithe. He could have lived off the wealth while volunteering to serve others and preach the gospel. In fact, I think retired people have such an awesome opportunity to serve in the church because they got the time. This is something I've realized once I've had kids. It's amazing what having kids shows you. It shows you that retired people and single people and people who are married without kids are really important to the church. Now, yes, families with kids are important because that's the next generation, but that's the thing. Your job in serving the church is discipling your kids. God has given us singles. He's given us people who don't have kids yet, and he's given us retirees, empty nesters, to do a lot of the other work. Because guess what? At one point in your life, you pretty much fit into all those, most of us are going to fit into all those categories during our life. We'll be single, we'll be married without kids, some of us longer than others, and then we'll have kids, and then we'll be empty nesters. So, we're at the different stages in our life where our serving God and serving the church will look different. It's not a bad thing, because God designed it to work that way. So he could have done that. He could have hired young men and trained them in the business since he could afford their mistakes, right? Right. He's got enough. All right, I'm going to teach young men. I'm going to bring them in here, and I'm not going to have to worry then about getting all worked up when they do something wrong. I can actually stop and teach them because my livelihood doesn't depend upon it anymore. So what if they do something stupid? Like running the tractor out of oil. Not that I've ever done anything like that. Okay, right? It's not a big deal. It is a big deal when you're trying to make it, aren't you? Isn't it? It's not as a big deal if you can absorb the cost, right? And you can absorb those young men making those mistakes that they make. Right? And so all those advantages, all those different ways in which he could serve God, and none of them, he didn't care for any of them. It was all about serving himself. And so even though he had all the possessions, even though he fits the definition in a sense in Proverbs of a wise man, he is actually a fool because he doesn't understand the basic concept of stewardship. So let's look at the other parable that Jesus says where we truly see the wise man. So Matthew. So Matthew 25:14. For it will be like a man going on a journey. Well, who's the man going on a journey? Jesus, right? Who calls his servants and entrusts to them his property. His servants, right? Those who believe in Jesus. That's you and me. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. Now that's a little bit of a hard pill to swallow if you're like me and somewhat ambitious. God gives to everyone according to what he can handle. So if you don't have a lot, I don't know if that was actually, as pastors, right? We always like to have the bigger, God gives us what we can handle. So sometimes that can be a hard pill to swallow if we want more, if we're uncontent with what God has given us. 16, he who had received the 5 talents went at once in trade with them, and he made 5 talents more. All right, so it's not his, right? But he takes what is God's and he increases it, right? Christ has entrusted you and me, and we'll talk about in a minute what all those things are. Particularly, we're talking about possessions. He's entrusted you and me with certain things, and our job is to do what? Go and make it more. Okay? Now, yes, we could go and make it more, and something like Job could happen. But who controls when something like what happened to Job happens? God. And it's God's stuff. So if we were doing the right things and something crazy happens so it's not there anymore, that's not on you, that's not on God. God's not mean, he's not cruel. Okay, as we're going to find out. So also, he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And also he who had 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. And these 2 are examples of what we read in Proverbs. The reason that they have extra, the reason they have treasures, because God gave them some things, and they went out and made those things more. Okay? Now we have the foolish. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. In other words, as he says quite frankly in 25, so I was afraid. I was afraid that if I invested it, took any risk, and I lost it, you would be really mad at me. And indeed, when we take stupid, foolish risks, I don't think God is happy with that, but we're not talking about those kinds of risks. And I went and hid your talents in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reaped where I have not sown and gathered where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have at least received what was my own with interest. Because apparently they had interest rates back then, and inflation. And so if you don't have your money, then you lose money because inflation. But anyways, so take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And see, this really just throws a smack on Marxism and all that garbage. Because Marxism, first off, assumes that the only way the rich get rich or an employer gets rich is by exploiting those who work for him. Does Jesus exploit those who work for him? No. And see, when we take that mindset, then we have the wrong mindset when we have our job. Now, does that mean that people who are rich, who employ a lot of people, don't exploit people? No, right? Many of them sadly do, right? And the Bible talks about that. Hey, rich people, you don't pay. These people who have worked for you, not okay. All right? But see, what you really see at the end of it is not, the issue is not rich people are evil because they're rich, or poor people are evil because they're poor. The Bible doesn't teach any of that. The Bible teaches that all people have a sin nature and are evil. If you're following God and doing what He says, and you're poor, then you're a righteous poor person because you have Christ's righteousness. If you're a rich person and you've given your life to Christ and you're following Christ, then you're a rich person with Christ's righteousness who does good things. It's not whether you have the stuff that makes you evil or having the stuff. Now, the reason that you may or may not have the stuff, if it's because of godlessness, now that is something you need to deal with. But we don't just say rich people are because they're rich or poor people are evil because they're poor. It has to do with much deeper heart issues and decisions about whether they're following God and how they got there. And I think that is clear teaching, where Marxism just teaches one side is evil just because that's what Marx felt like on that particular day. But what do we see with these good stewards? They understood that it wasn't their stuff, first off. And that's very important for you and me to understand this. Nothing that you and I own is actually ours. Secondly, they did what they did for God, not themselves. They did it for God, not for them. Not so that they could have a good life, but they did it for God. Thirdly, what else has God given you to steward besides money and stuff? Because I think God has given us way more. For example, the gospel. You and I are stewards of the gospel. There's family. Your family. Your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad, your husband, your wife, your kids. God, those are blessings from God that He's entrusted to you. Those relationships are blessings from God that He has entrusted to you. The church family, we are stewards of that. Our natural talents. I'm not good at math, but if you were good at math or something else, that's a natural talent. How about spiritual gifts? Some of you are like, I don't know what my spiritual gift is. You think that might be a stewardship problem? We got a membership class starting March. Remember, after church we eat, bring something to eat. We have a membership class, we're going to talk about spiritual gifts. Just saying, if you want to figure that out, start being a good steward on that. That's a good place to start. God's grace. How about a job? Not only are you a steward to God in your job, whether or not you have a good boss or a crappy boss, in your job, you are a steward of the person who employs you. And you're not only blessing them by doing the best you can with that job, you're ultimately blessing yourself. Because again, you're being what? A steward. Right? And so these attitudes, these things, you just think within this church, right? God has blessed me, and, if you think about this, as a pastor, God, as our deacons, as church leaders, right? We're entrusted and steward with the church that we're at, right? Song leaders are entrusted with the songs, and the pianist is entrusted with pianist, and the secretary is entrusted with doing the secretary work. We are all entrusted with things that which God has given us and which He will call us account for. And so to take home, remember, the difference between the wise and the foolish when it comes to possessions is the wise man invests his wealth, which is his wealth, natural talents, and spiritual talents for God's glory. The foolish man spends all that he has on himself. That's really what it comes down to. It's all about himself. And you can be poor because all you care about is yourself, and you can be rich because all you care about is yourself. And I want you to leave you these 4 statements. Remember this: God owns everything and I own nothing. Second one, God entrusts me with everything I have. Thirdly, I am responsible to increase what God has given me. And fourth, God can call me into account anytime He wants, just like with the rich fool. Right? You go home, have a heart attack, wreck your car, and you could be in God's presence, and God could be asking Pastor Ben this very afternoon, all right, I gave you that church. Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And that doesn't just go for me, that goes for every single one of you here. God gave you this to do in this church. God, you gave you this to do over here. God gave you this family. Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And for some of us, that could be a great time of joy, and for others, not so much. I know that's a heavy thought to lead us with, but just think about that. Remember, God's not cruel, right? And so let us trust on His grace and seek to please Him. Father God, we thank You for today.